For this third video in my Halloween 2022 series, I'll show you how to create 4 quick cards using 2 simple backgrounds and using stamps and dies you already have in your stash. And the best part, each card takes less than 20 minutes. I bought this Simon Says Stamp Gothic Halloween stamp. I was so excited to get this. I immediately thought of so many things I could do with this background stamp. So I'm going to use this background stamp in the first 2 cards. I'm also going to use this Spellbinder's Simply Perfect Layered Blooms in the first card. And I have a couple of pieces of patterned paper here. This is a double-sided paper. It is from the Parklane Haunted Hollow collection. I'm going to be using both sides of this patterned paper and also a small piece of just black cardstock, a layering weight cardstock to die cut the flowers. So we're going to start with the background, and I have a piece of 8.5 by 5 1/4 paper. I'm sorry, 8.5 by 5 1/2, and I've scored it at 4 1/4. So this is actually the card base for the card. This is a direct to card. We're not going to do any sort of a top panel. Everything's going directly on the card. So we're going to start with this background stamp, and I will be using a Versamark embossing pad and also some clear embossing powder. This is from Sizzix. So, a couple of schools of thought on these large red rubber background stamps. I personally like to just ink up the stamp on my craft mat and then lay my paper on the top and try to line it up very carefully. It depends on how brave you are with your stamps. So if you look at this stamp, it actually does have sort of a direction depending on what you want to see. Here's Happy Halloween here. I think I'm going to do this. So, all right, so here's what we're going to do. I've already scored my card. You can see this is the valley. Here's the mountain, so it's going to fold this way. This is the front of my card. So I am going to ink up my stamp. Make sure it's fairly straight here. And I only want to ink up to the fold. So I'm going to be very careful when I place this down that it's even on each side and I'm not inking above this fold. I'm keeping it flat because I find that for me, it works better than trying to fold it and having the fold move around. So this is how I'm used to doing it. I'm going to go ahead and ink up my stamp. Again, this is just Versamark ink. And I don't need to ink all the way to the bottom. This is a, let's see, 5.5 by 5.5 square stamp. I did measure it. All right, and I'm only gonna get one shot at this because I'm not doing this in the MISTI, so I'm making sure that I get really good coverage with my stamp pad. All right, here it goes. I'm going to press, making sure that I get every bit of this card front in contact with this stamp. Here is our stamped impression. I am going to emboss this, heat emboss this. I am using Sizzix clear embossing powder today. And I'm using the folded paper method to catch my powder. And I'm just going to make sure that I get every inch of this paper. My embossing powder feels a little bit clumpy. And I have an idea to put a those little silica gel desiccant packs in my embossing powder. Let me know if you have tried that and if it works. I think sometimes when the climate or the weather is a little bit humid, embossing powder can get a little bit clumpy. However, this embossing powder works very, very well. Okay, that's it. The background is complete, and moving on, I'm going to die cut some of these flowers, these stems and leaves from the Spellbinders Simply Perfect Layered Blooms, and I'm using this Parklane double-sided pattern paper and just a plain black piece of layering weight cardstock. Okay, here are my die cuts. So, confession, I've never used this die set. I think these are how these flowers go together, and honestly, we're creating. So, apologies if I don't assemble these flowers perfectly. But honestly, I've noticed they are kind of easy to line up. So I think this is how these flowers are assembled. You can see the look we're going for here. Loving it. Okay, I'm ready to start assembling this card front. Again, this isn't going onto a panel, it's going directly onto the front of the card. And that is it. That is the finished, fully assembled front of our first card. Really great tone-on-tone look. Okay, card number 2. Same process with your card base. You are going to just heat emboss, clear embossing powder, same stamp, different treatment. So we're going to use the Tim Holtz Halloween Sentiments set. You could use any of these. They all will work really well for this card. Use any large greeting stamp that you have. It will work. All right, so I'm going to use, it's just a bunch of Hocus Pocus. I am going to use my Misty. And I am going to stamp. It's just a bunch of Hocus Pocus on some heavy white cardstock. I am going to use Distress Mica stain for this step, and heavier cardstock takes the stain a little better without warping. It seems to not absorb as much of the liquid stain. So line this up a bit. Want nice heavy coverage, so I am going to ink it up twice, making sure I put it back exactly where it was. I'm going to check this and make sure it didn't shift before I inked it a second time. That looks great. Bringing back my little folded paper, my Sizzix clear embossing powder. This is an emboss resist technique. I'll be putting ink over the top and making sure I get really nice coverage with the embossing powder here. I really want this to stand out. I'm also not using an anti-static powder tool. For some reason, the Sizzix embossing powder today is doing a great job. It's not sticking where I don't want it. It might be just because I have a really large greeting and the background stamp was very large. Okay, I'll heat emboss this greeting very quickly. Okay, give this just a moment to cool. Okay, next up, Distress Mica stain. I have used this for many of my Halloween cards. I am going to use Burning Ember. I also made a test card with Fortune Teller. It looked amazing. Use any of these mica stains that you have on hand. If you don't have mica stain, use a spray. Use a spray stain. Any of these Tim Holtz products will work for this because you have now created a barrier on the front of this card that will keep this stain from penetrating under this emboss. So, splatter box. Now, have a folded paper towel ready. As soon as you pull this out of your spray box, you're going to wipe the top. You're going to close the paper towel down. I'll show you what I mean. And make sure that my Burning Ember is thoroughly shaken. Wipe. Good coverage. Quickly move it to a paper towel. Close the top. ever sometimes just make something and you tell yourself, that is gorgeous? In the interest of time, I'm going to hit this with a heat tool very quickly to dry it. Okay, the piece is dry. Let's move on to cutting this greeting into strips. I'm going to trim this down in my tonic trimmer, and I'm starting by just trimming the sides down to between 1/4 and 1/2 inch. Now, if you're going to use this Hocus Pocus sentiment, this greeting, be very careful when you trim. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim each of these lines of type apart into separate strips. And the way I'm doing this with this tonic trimmer is I'm lining up exactly in between. You can see at the edge of this piece that you hold down, you can see exactly where you're trimming. And I'm being very careful not to cut the words. I have all the strips I've created for my greeting, and it's time to assemble the front of the card. Okay, I have all of my greeting strips and I'm ready to start putting these on the front of the card. I am going to use this Helix T-Square. It's a really great tool for making sure that everything is level on the front of your card, especially when you are applying sentiment strips. So the layout today that I'm going to use for this one, I'm placing 2 of my strips to the left, 2 of my strips to the right. Experiment, see which layout you like best when you are designing your card. Here are the 2 cards side by side, same background, completely different look between these 2 cards. Okay, on to the next card. Okay, here is the die set for the next card. Spellbinder's Haunted House, very nice die set, cuts really, really well. I'm also going to pull in this greeting and this little sentiment, "Oh, what a night," from the Simon Says stamp, hand-lettered Halloween. For the base of the card, I am going to use Hero Art's Hero Hues 111-pound Premier Cardstock, and the color is mustard. I'm going to use a couple of Post-it notes to mask off the top of my card, which actually, when this is folded, is the back of the card, so I don't get ink there. I'm going to apply this Distress Oxide ink fairly heavily. I want really opaque coverage, and also we don't have a lot of elements on this card, so I'm making the most of inking and embossing to really make this card pop. I need to create a mask that I'll use in this next step. I'm using a piece of plain white cardstock from my scrap bin, and I'm measuring and penciling in the shape of a hill that will look nice on my card. I'm going to use my scissors to cut out the mask, and then I can tape this down to my card front. I'm using Distress Oxide ink in Black Soot for my hill. And again, I want really heavy opaque coverage down here. I'm going to create a second hill on the front of this card as well, so that hill will be just slightly darker. I'll reuse my mask for the second hill. I'm inking up just a little bit darker, and I'm covering over that part of the first hill that's showing. I'll remove the mask. The background is complete, and I'm ready to move on to die cutting with this Spellbinders Haunted House set. I have all of my die cuts, and I am going to use Versamark embossing ink, and I'm also going to bring back that Sizzix Clear embossing powder to emboss some of these die cuts. Okay, I'm only going to clear emboss the bats, the moon, and the house. So I will apply embossing ink to all surfaces first. Then I will apply powder to all surfaces, and then I will heat emboss each one. I'm going to apply this embossing powder fairly heavily. In fact, I may ink this up twice. I'll look at it and see how I feel. I'm going to use this detail blending brush from Altenew. I love these little brushes. This says it's a 7. I'm not sure if that's the number of the brush. But you don't want very much ink. So I dab, I take most of the ink off, and then I rub lightly to create some lines on my ghost. You're great. Okay, how about the clouds? Same thing. Moving on to our greeting, I'm going to stamp this Halloween greeting from the Simon Says Stamp hand-lettered Halloween stamp set. I'm also going to use this tiny Oh What a Night stamp. Okay, so I am going to stamp this on black cardstock. A scrap of black cardstock will do. Again, I'm using Versamark embossing ink, and I'm using Sizzix Clear Detail embossing powder. And I'm going to ink this up twice so I get really good coverage. Simon Says Stamp stamps stamp so beautifully. Okay, back to our Sizzix Clear embossing powder. This embossing powder has had a workout today. Just making sure I don't miss any spots with my embossing powder, and once I'm happy with the coverage, I'm ready to heat emboss. Looks great. Okay, I'm going to tape this down and die cut this. And we are nearly finished with this card. Okay, I'm ready to start assembling the front of the card. I'm going to start with the largest piece, the focal point, which is this haunted house. And I'm just lining this up on the side of my hill. All of the other die cuts will sort of fall into place in the design once I've placed this house. I want my Halloween greeting to sit up here, so I want to make sure that my moon is sort of hanging on the end of this in Halloween. Next, I'll place the clouds, and I'll give these clouds a little bit of dimension by popping them up over the top of the moon. Next, I'll place my ghosts so they appear to be popping out of the windows. I am popping up that top ghost on a tiny piece of foam square to give the piece a little more dimension. And then I will place my bats over on the left-hand side to help balance out the entire scene. I'm going to use foam squares to adhere my greeting, and I'm going to cut some of these foam squares into tiny strips to make sure that every part of my greeting is supported. I'll adhere my greeting, again making sure that the N at the end of Halloween just touches the top of the moon. Next, I'll adhere the steps to the front of the card, making sure that I follow the contour of that darker colored hill. The last step for this card is to stamp that "Oh What a Night" sentiment from Hand Lettered Halloween. I am using VersaFine Clair ink in Nocturne, and I'm just going to stamp this with a stamp block. Okay, that is card 1 completed. I love how simple elements like an ink blended background and some embossing really help a card to stand out. For the second card, I used the Simon Says Stamp Home Sweet Haunted Home stamp set. As you can see in the finished card, I used the same techniques as in the first card, inking on a colored card base, embossed die cuts, and dimension with foam squares to create a simple card that has lots of pop. You can use any haunted house or haunted forest stamp or die set to create this exact same look. Thanks for joining me for the third card in this Halloween series. If you'd like to be notified when the final card video launches, please subscribe.